Finally, we are here, the Empire of Man tier list, and this is probably going to be broken into two halves, this one being the core roster, and the next video will be the unique state troops. If you haven't already seen my 8 unit types where I boil down the entire game's units into 8 categories, I recommend you do that if you are a newer player. This will really help you get an idea of what we're talking about because it can be overwhelming. I invite you to check out the rest of the channel for the most thoroughly made and condensed guides going through legendary level strategies that will be applicable to new and veterans. If you haven't seen the Empire 20-minute mastery guide, check that out after this and you will be well on your way. We'll be doing my usual format running from tier 1 all the way up to tier 5 so we can tell the story of your campaign as well as the challenges that you'll need to address throughout it. This gives a clearer idea of how units compete and their relevancy, and this is for every difficulty, easy all the way up to legendary. Especially in Warhammer 3, the difference in difficulty has a very minute impact in the overall scheme of things, and what works well on legendary will work exceptionally well on normal. Just a quick overview of the tiers. S is overpowered, there is nothing better than this, they could nerf it, it would still be good, and every faction should have maybe 1 or 2 of these units, and this is typically going to sum up what they are good at. This is the creme de la creme. I'm not asking for these to be nerfed, but these are so good and they encapsulate everything that makes this faction good. Under this is A tier, just an excellent unit, and these top 2 tiers will absolutely carry you on the higher levels of difficulty. B is solid. This is a very good unit and will still easily punch for the next tier above, and C is just usable, and that is not a dirty word. You can even use this to decent effect, may it be as a support unit, even on the higher levels of difficulty, but it is just outshone in the face of better options. D is outperformed and very outshone at the stage of the game where you get it, and F is so bad you should never get it, and it is a simple waste of your funds and time. Now starting off at tier 1 are the basic Spearmen, and you can recruit this unit absolutely anywhere, and unfortunately we're off to a rocky start in D, outperformed, and the reason is there is a much better variant with a shield and it only requires a barracks. This shielded version should be the version that you always get. Now they've boast the best melee defense, making it the best line holder they have, and it has a shield which will block about 1/3 of all incoming missiles. Now just one quick thing about the Empire Infantry, this is a medieval society. If you are anyone, you are most likely riding a horse. So the Empire Infantry kind of begin and end at tier 3 here, so this is all your run-of-the-mill Joes. They do a bit of basic training on the weekends, but this isn't quite a professional force, and you will need to use your generals and your technologies to get them up to the point where you need them to be effective. But the basic Spearmen, the only time you should ever hire this unit is if you need to crisis hire an army, an incoming invasion is coming, and you need a few line holders, as well as a few archers to hold the line. But in the face of any other alternative in melee, you should always get the shielded variant, which is absolutely B tier and will be the mainstay of your defensive infantry. So long as they're standing still, they will brace and eliminate the charge bonus of any horses, so check out my formations guide, but you'll see I always recommend having Spearmen at the 4 corners of your formation to be able to spread out and face and absorb any incoming charges. This is the unit that you want the enemy to run into, and then bring your own offensive infantry or horses around the flank to get a bit of hammer and anvil in. This is absolutely a B tier solid unit. What they do lack in training and leadership, they make up for the fact that they at least carry a shield and will be able to screen against other enemies. Boasting high melee defense, meaning they're harder to hit, and the anti-large will hit anything that's big enough to bowl them over. If you're overwhelmed with the choices of infantry, this is a great one to get. When in doubt, get shielded Spearmen. Just a quick reminder guys, if you are enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, it really helps out. Ask any question in the comments, I answer everything, and if you'd like to talk strategy, feel free to join the Discord. Cheers. But for the love of God, unless you're in a dire crisis, never hire a basic Spearman without a shield. Instead, just get a barracks and get instead our next entry in B tier, the humble Swordsman. Now this acts as a pseudo mix between an offensive and defensive infantryman. See the 8 unit guide to understand the difference, but these guys, they don't have a great charge bonus, but they will do a lot more damage to other infantry than your basic spears will. In the early game, you'll be fighting a lot of infantry, so these guys actually do have a use. Slightly better charge, armor piercing, which doesn't make sense because they're swords, but anyway, tie the enemy up with your spears and then charge the swordsmen into their flanks. They will hit much easier with the enemy melee defense lowered by 1/3 from the side and 2/3 from the rear. Now I can already picture some Warhammer 2 players typing in the comments that they're awful, and in Warhammer 2 they absolutely were. This is a brand new meta, and melee does so much more thanks to a decrease in reload speed as well as less buffs on the AR side. This is a new game, and if you don't invest in your infantry as the Empire, you won't have a front line to hammer and anvil against with your cavalry, or protect your valuable gunpowder units. The very first technologies you should get are the infantry upgrades, increasing their leadership as well as their armor by 15 and extra melee defense, which is going to be huge. I cannot insist how important it is that you get at least these 3 upgrades. You can get the 4th later. Before you go over to missiles, it is far more important to invest in something that will help you in hard battles than something that will just help make easy battles easier. Put at least 1 point in Emperor's Finest. This will give you +4 melee defense, which will really make a large difference. I would actually recommend getting at least 2 points, if not 3, because this will make your basic units that you'll want to take with you. The people that are having trouble with the Empire are simply neglecting their infantry by not investing lord skills or technologies in them. Your cavalry, artillery, and missile weapons are great. You just need to make sure that front line can hold. Now, later in your campaign, you will certainly find these guys getting outclassed, getting beat up, and retreating more than you know. But if you invest in all the points here, you can at least last a bit longer, and their stats really aren't too bad once you can get them to tier 7. But it is very important that you structure your formations to incorporate the leadership bubbles of the various heroes and priest spells. Now, without the upgrades, these guys are definitely only a C tier unit, but if you upgrade things at the right time, they will do very well for you. Half of your starting army should roughly comprise shielded spearmen, as well as these guys. Have 1 or 2 cavalry units charge in from the flanks, and have your remaining slots for heroes and missile units to do the rest. Next up, we have the Free Company Militia, and man did I want to put these guys in B tier so badly. They follow the same tropes of Empire infantry, shirkily trained, but they're a lot more free-spirited, wielding an Empire sword in one hand and a pistol in the other, and this gives them the ability to be hybrid units and kite around the enemy. The thing is though, they can't shoot over their shoulders, so they do need to be situated still to be able to fire, but they do have 36 foot speed, so they can kite around most other infantry they'll come up against and then get a rear charge in. Now, if you're a micro master, you can absolutely get B tier efficiency out of these guys, and boy did I want to put them in B tier, but I just can't do it. The simple reason is you get cavalry pistoliers that essentially do the same thing very soon. Their melee stats just don't buff to be anything special, and they will just date in what they do. Their pistols don't have armor piercing. I like to throw a couple in my armies for a bit of fun, but you can really do without them, and they get outclassed by cavalry. Now, our next unit would have been B tier back in Warhammer 2, where the range meta allowed the extra reload speed to dominate absolutely everything land-based, and the low upkeep of this unit made it an easy beat for B tier. You could do so much with this and punch above your weight. If you adapted a min-max approach trying to make the cheapest armies overperform, this was the tool to do it. The problem is it is very outclassed and very soon by things like Crossbows and Handgunners, and I simply don't believe in hiring units and building them up in my armies, getting experience when that slot could be used for something that will have legs instead. I used to really like this unit, but now I really do think they are rather trash, except in a handful of min-max style situations. Now, if you do like min-maxing, this is probably the tool to use, but in any other case, as long as you invest in your infantry, which is going to be a game-long investment, then just go with that. Research that bolsters infantry will bolster all of your garrisons across the entire kingdom. It does need to be noted, if you put these guys with a Huntsmaster General or Wolfheart, then they do perform at a B tier level. I prefer the regular General on a Griffin, or using the Elector for his healing and buffs. I never hire this unit anymore. The only time I ever do is if it's a brand new holding that I've taken and I need to raise a crisis army right away. At low levels, that General can perform very well and bolster these guys quite handsomely by increasing their range. If you don't have a barracks, throwing a couple of basic spearmen in the way as chaff, and you have an army that can at least hit back relatively decently. This is only a throwaway army to deal with the threat. After, disband it and instead invest in tier 2 units like the crossbow, and this is the reason why I think the archers are so crap now, because this unit just does the same job but significantly better. This is the power unit of your early tiers and will deal a large majority of your damage, launching volleys of bolts over your shielded spearmen and swordsmen. They have 160 range, much greater than the terrible archer, and there's no reason not to wait for these. Getting a tier 2 barracks takes no time at all. Don't waste your time with the crappy basic archer, wait for the crossbows, invest in them, and they will look after you for a long time. Trust me. After you've invested in your basic infantry, putting points of research into archery is your next best bet, because these advances will carry through to gunpowder weapons. Supporting your early game units should absolutely be these first 2 units that you see in tier 2, the shielded spearmen and the crossbowmen. Having 8 crossbowmen in the center of your formation, 4 shielded spearmen and some swordsmen, your starting units of heroes and cavalry, should be a good rounded force to help you get through to the next tier. Make sure you sub and see the upcoming formations formations video which will best demonstrate this. A couple of swordsmen in there will still pull their weight if you have increased them, because the majority of the threats will be infantry and they can help grind down the infantry. However, later on you will need a bit more bite, and it seems they trust the halberd with people with a little bit more experience. They're an unusual defensive unit that can somewhat act as a countercharger if you invest all the way up the red tree, giving them an extra 10% physical resist as well as some extra melee attack. Now you can actually give these guys technology which will give them charge defense versus everything, meaning they can stay still and wash off all charge bonuses, but this isn't a technology you'll probably prioritize, because at this point your research will probably be aimed at your ranged weapons because you're nearing the gunpowder stage. You're not really fighting many big armored enemies at this point, and when you do, you're going to have muskets to blast them apart. The other thing that hurts their appeal is their two-handed halberd means they can't carry a shield, and I know Empire shields are only bronze, they only block a third of everything, but still that's a third of the arrows that aren't hitting you, and it is well worth it. So is this a replacement for your units? Well, not really. It's a tool like so many others. The shielded spearmen will still be your best defensive unit. That said, later on they will struggle against some of the larger monsters, monstrous infantry, and large beasts, and the halberdiers can come in and certainly take a chunk out of them. Between 2 and 4 is probably all you would need, and you certainly don't spam these guys. They are there to support your shielded spearmen, and in many cases they will straight out replace your swordsmen. You will need an armory to build these in the first place, and an armory is not something you should be rushing at tier 2. When you get to tier 3 or tier 4, the armory is an excellent building. It's incredible. It allows more local recruitment as well as +1 global recruitment, and this is so powerful by the end of the game, allowing you to levy armies anywhere, and that's not including your regiments of renown or state troops, which you can also levy absolutely anywhere. Rushing to get halberdiers I don't think is in many players' high-end playbook. Before we move on from the infantry, just a reminder that these are just your regular levied troops. The Elector counts do not trust each other, so their states are basically in a state of military readiness, but not at the expense of their economy and their other cultural ventures. The Empire military is famed for being organised, giving people above average equipment, and managing their logistics with absolute mastery. But they also value their economy, and these guys are basically part-timers, are not career soldiers, and I can't reiterate how much they will need help from technology and good leadership from a general to make sure they can hang as the tiers go on. Because if you are someone, you are now rocking over 100 armor and you're riding a damn horse. The Empire Knight does require the level 2 armory or the blacksmith, but it is well worth getting a couple of these in your armies. If you've invested in your infantry, you have a solid anvil, and these guys are the hammer, and they arguably can do an A tier job at this point in the game, but my tiers pretty much define and demand that the unit can also punch 1 or 2 tiers above, and the only reason why they aren't an A tier is because when it comes tier 4, they will start to really fear what they're charging into. At this early stage of the game, it definitely operates as A tier, but it will start to taper off due to a lack of armor piercing. These heavy cav used to be too slow to catch anything, but they have been buffed like all Empire cavalry have to have a speed of 78, allowing them to chase things down and, more importantly, avoid enemy arrow fire, which they can block with their shield, and then getting that charge in. So they're faster, more survivable, but they also have to compete with the state troop variants, of which there are so many Empire Knights to choose from. But even still, it is a B tier solid unit, and I would recommend 2, no more than 4 in any army, and they will make the difference. And finishing up tier 2, the Pistoliers, and this is another unit that I really so badly wanted to give B tier. It's a skirmish gunfire unit, which is not only awesome, if you're great at micro, you can get excellent mileage out of this. It has 90 speed, making it the fastest cavalry. They can Parthian shot, shooting 360 degrees around them, can be a right nuisance, and of course tear apart enemy artillery. So why are they only C tier? Their pistols do not have armor piercing. Enemy armor will advance, and you'll find yourself running away from more enemies than you are actually running after. They're also pretty bad in melee, so when they do charge in, you need to get them out quickly because enemies will get more savage. These guys simply won't. Don't get me wrong, when given the chance at this stage, I will hire a couple of these guys. They are fun and they give great tactical options, but whilst they can harass excellent in the early game, you will soon find that they are the ones getting bullied. Their bullets bouncing off the enemy and being afraid to charge into anything. Jumping into tier 3 with our very first S tier overpowered unit, and if you'd guessed it was a caster, you would be right, of course it is. Amazing nimble mount in the form of a flying Pegasus, check. Every single amazing law of magic that you could really want with an army like this, check. These guys are amazing, and with their mount, they should never ever get caught. The law of fire does great damage and is particularly devastating against undead, which of course you'll be fighting with the vampire counts. The law of life is useful, but you cannot go past, in my eyes, the best by far is the law of light. The net of Lamentok can pin a single lord in place, allowing them to get shredded by your gunpowder. Overcast a spell and you can pin down several units and just absolutely nuke them. Now the AI is better at dodging artillery now, so just fly ahead with this guy, pin a whole pile of units in place and then nuke them with your Hellstorms. The value of light magic has only gotten better, particularly with better AI that like to flank more, and you will find your brave front line starting to falter a bit against the heavier enemy threats, so pinning them down to make this more manageable and soften them up with gunpowder by keeping them still is just so invaluable, and then you can cast banishment on any infantry blobs. Another great lore for the Empire is beast magic. Flock of Doom deals dependable damage in infantry blobs, which you'll have to deal with, and the ability to summon a wild manticore is very good, and man, it's very useful as the Empire. Again, if they have a large enemy, pin them in place with this disposable manticore and then shred them with gunpowder. Speaking of which, this wizard can also get a griffin mount, which if nothing else is totally badass. I would only recommend one wizard, preferably light, but if you want to support them with a beast wizard, then you can do that too. The lack of large entities makes life magic less appealing for the Empire than other factions, although you can use these to heal your Demigryph knights. Next in A tier, probably to no one's surprise, is the Handgunner. This is an excellent unit and it deals all the armor piercing that this army would really need at this stage of the game. I would recommend between 4 and 10 of these at this stage of the game because honestly they deal with everything. Your crossbows are still useful because they can volley over the top of these, so build your formations accordingly. Even in my late game armies, I will still have between 4 and maybe even 8 handgunners. The same cannot be said at all for the Huntsmen. This unit is typically goddamn awful. Its charm is that it does anti-large damage from afar, but you just don't need this. Anything that's large and worth a damn is going to be run down way quicker with gunpowder than by arrows. Yes, you can volley over the top, but just use crossbows to do this if you're that desperate. These guys are overpriced, they can't shoot backwards. The only time you should ever hire these guys are if you have a Huntsman General or Marcus Wolfhard who can make them hit several tiers higher. This stage of the game is about handgunners, support melee infantry, and some cavalry to get the charges. Our next entry is an excellent hero, and this is the Warrior Priest. These guys, you need at least one, if not two, in every single army. As a result, this is the hero that you should probably be seeing the most of. You should be aiming to increase the melee defense, hit points and armor of them as soon as possible. You want these guys to hold the line. But even higher priority is replenishment to make sure your losses replenish quicker. Having 2 of these guys in any army will ensure you never have replenishment problems, but more importantly, keep the surrounding units 35 meters away from them. You can see this radius by hovering over the icon and ensure that you have melee units on each side of these. The battle prayers allow a massive buff to melee attack as well as 20% resistance to all forms of damage. Have these guys hotkeyed, wait for the enemy to come in and then trigger this ability. The brave and humble Empire infantry will love having these guys around because the priest can also bolster their leadership even more. The importance of these guys in keeping your infantry relevant cannot be understated, and if an enemy surrounds them, just rain hellfire down on them. Now there is actually a decent argument to have these guys on a barded warhorse. I know I typically recommend keeping heroes like this on foot, but the advantage of having them mobile on a horse means if they do break, they can run back into the battle. Also, if there's a unit that's starting to get a bit broken, you can come in, give them a buff, and bolster their leadership. Always keep in mind that 35 meter radius between your other units when you deploy these guys, and they will never let you down, and having 1 in every army is mandatory. 2, you can't go too wrong. And on top of all of this, you can stimulate growth, increasing the growth rate of any province they're in. I would just love a few more buffs and better ways to boost their stats so they could reach S tier because they certainly deserve it. Now, speaking of characters that could use a bit of a buff, the Empire Captain is possibly one of the most in need in the entire game. Boy, do these guys feel power creep more than almost anything else. It's also because of the army they comprise part of. They are an offensive infantry unit in an army that sorely needs defensive line holders. This guy's a foot soldier who's worked his way up through the grunts, wielding spears, swords, maybe even a halberd, and he's ended up here, but he's still not exactly the epitome of grace, and he will get beat up way too easy for a melee line holder. Now you can use the hold the line ability, which is quite nice, and it's a great area of effect buff. You can certainly hang with the best of them, but you'll just find this guy doesn't quite have enough bite. Now, whilst they don't have the greatest reputation, they actually are a lot better in some cases than some people would give them credit for. Now, the tip is do not not put them on the Imperial Pegasus straight away. You don't want to be even considering this mount until your hero has reached about tier 30. At this point you will have been able to bolster their melee stats enough to make it worthwhile taking. This character is just a little bit too fragile to be cycle charging into things, and there's not enough mass with the Imperial Pegasus to make it a great cycle charger. Instead, this is a bit more of an assassin style character. The Pegasus boasts excellent speed and can get massive charge bonuses when using Deadly Onslaught, meaning you can actually go in for a deadly charge and absolutely wreck an enemy character, making them an almost pseudo duelist. The problem is this isn't exactly what you need. Unless you're excellent with micro, honestly, just leave them on the Barded Warhorse or on foot. If you have them, throw them in your armies, but do not bother upgrading to tier 3 barracks just to get these. You will gain a ton of these guys from Confederation, so you don't really need to build them. Next up, and it pains me to do it, we have a C tier hero. Very, very rare. I tend to be very, very generous towards heroes, but particularly on the battlefield, which is where we do the lion's share of this assessment. The Witch Hunter is a hybrid infantry. Using a flintlock pistol, it can take decent armor piercing shots out of enemy heroes, but it just doesn't do enough to hold the line, and that's what this army requires. We must review things in context, and that context is what does this faction require of them, and they need line holders, not assassins. We have gunpowder for that. You quite likely will come across the odd holding which really needs some public order, so you can build this building, and these guys make excellent scouts, and this is how you should use them. They have the block army ability, allowing you to catch troublesome enemy armies, and you can also stack these guys with some excellent followers. Ferryman and Outrider will give you a huge increase to line of sight. So whilst you don't need to go out of your way to build them, if they are available, they are the best scouts going around keeping the faith, and you can stack them with anti-corruption and public order followers to help bring you conquests under control. Do not underestimate how good the Empire's followers are. They are excellent, and you can very quickly transform a hideous rundown corrupt settlement. Next up, on a far more positive note, we have the Empire Mortars, and these Mortars are an absolute staple to any early Empire army. On the harder difficulties, the AI will absolutely dodge you more, but drawing a wider line of these guys will make their shots much harder to dodge. But most importantly, they are very, very accurate for what they're aiming to do. As soon as the enemy is engaged against your front line, fire shots over your units and then bombard the enemy when they're pinned down. Alternatively, use the evasion against them. If they start targeting you with archers or missile units, start bombarding them. Shooting straight up in the air means they perform very well in sieges. This is an excellent unit with amazing range, and this will force the enemy to come to you. Honestly, one or two of these is absolutely sensible and will really ensure that you can control your engagements. Now, while we're on the topic of gunpowder, the Outrider, a group of horse-riding musket wielders, and they do excellent armor piercing damage, so they've got a better range than the Pistoliers, and they can do so much more damage to something with armor. At 84 speed, you can easily kite away from infantry, unloading and then running away some more. In the early tiers, this unit can devastate any armored enemies, and also get a decent cycle charge into the rear. The problem that they will face is that they don't have enough stopping power when heavier infantry are approaching. High armored infantry with shields, these guys don't have enough stopping power to hold them in place, and they soon enough find themselves, much later albeit, like the Pistoliers. They are running away more than they're doing anything else, and this is an incredibly micro-intensive task. The Empire roster is incredibly dynamic, but it wants the action to be happening close to its central formation so it can interact with its various pieces. This unit of horses could end up running across the other side of the map trying to deal damage to a singular unit, and the Empire needs its formations to hold together in unity. And you end up with a unit that's too scared to get into melee for any length of time, and they've only got 60 guns in their unit as opposed to basic handgunners who have 90 muskets. Now, when you get these, they are good. They will do what you want them to do, but you're going to find them really struggling at tier 4 and tier 5 just because they lack the stopping power. If I am going to run Outriders, I like to run them in pairs, and that goes the exact same for the grenade launcher variant. Pretty much the same guys on the same horse, but instead their rifle is replaced with a grenade launcher, and when you get these guys, boy do they smash. They cleanly get the A tier, and almost by default they push the regular variant down to usable. Now, you do need a gunsmith and a stable, which is an unlikely pairing to be had, so if you really like these guys, you're probably going to have to plan ahead to get them. With that said, if you're excellent with your micro and you love cavalry, these guys are a lot of fun. Go out, destroy the enemy artillery, and then come back, lobbing massive volleys of grenades into the enemy infantry that are held up against your shield wall. Now, while we're on cavalry, let's go to the vaunted Reiksguard, and this is basically a Karl Franz Reichland-centric unit and almost exclusive to them. You hire them from Altdorf from the unique building, and you can get these at tier 3, and they have good armor and leadership for this point. Now, in a basic army, they only really operate at B tier, but you can get them so damn early and so easily. The building to recruit these guys is quite expensive, so make sure that you hire these guys, only 3 or 4 units for Karl Franz's army, then destroy the building. They basically retire Empire Knights out of the early game if you play as Reichland. This means Karl Franz is going to be your main general, and he gives these guys massive buffs, including 15% physical resist and even anti-large, allowing them to take on a wealth of more enemies. Later in the campaign, don't be surprised if you replace them with Demigryphs, but in Karl's army, in the early mid-game, between 2 and 4 Reiksguard is absolutely mandatory. In Karl's army, they're A tier, but for everyone else, they sit solidly in B. Just to take a snapshot, if you've been following this from the start, taking a snapshot of the B tier and above, these are the units and pretty much the only units you need to build for tier 3 and arguably up to the start of tier 4. Focus yourself around these, and your formation should be centralized around giving your handgunners shots and opportunity. You can keep your costs down by having some crossbows volley over the top and only 2 to 4 units of cavalry supported by 1 or 2 mortars from the back. This will honestly handle anything at this point. Next we have a contender for the best horse-based cavalry in the entire Empire roster, and that is the Knights of the Blazing Sun, and they're falling here in B tier. And why is that if they're so good apparently? Well, the answer is they don't really become viable until you've built the capital at Telheim up to tier 4 and built the unique chapter building. Up until this point, until you get this building, you are facing a massive increase in upkeep as well as recruitment cost, and at this point this unit just is not worth it. Now, while you find Teller Backland are going to be one of the easier Elector counts to confederate, they just aren't one that you really want to get too early in the game, let alone being able to get it up to tier 4 with a building which then takes several more turns to build. This is really what grinds this unit down into being B tier, but regardless of that, its stats are what they are. If you end up avoiding the vampire counts until the mid to late game, it's a lot of fun, it does fire attacks and 78 charge bonus. This is going to absolutely bowl and shred through hordes of zombies. But like most Empire Knights, you'll find come tier 4 and especially later in tier 5, they will have a bit of trouble keeping up. Now our next unit is the Empire Greatswordsmen, and this is pretty much the best on paper infantryman they get. And how does it end up in C tier? Well, he's got enough money to coat himself in armor and swing a sword, but the comparative skill doesn't compare to that of the Empire Cavalry. Don't get me wrong, better armor and leadership means that they'll hold the line, but they have anti-infantry with their two-handed sword, so that means no shield, and they're good at killing infantry, which you will have no problem doing with your crossbows and handgun units. Any heavier things you can just send cavalry charges in to deal with, so this guy is basically dealing with a problem that you no longer have an issue with. The only issue they remotely solve is that of line holding, so if you want to have 1 or maybe 2 at the front center of your formation, that's not a foolish thing to do. However, my preference is to keep the cost down by using spearmen or halberds and using warrior priests to bolster them up. They will have a small window where they are a bright shining light, but then they will not be able to hang with the other elite infantry of the other factions. The notable exception to great swords is Karl Franz, who gives notable buffs to them, so keeping 2 or 4 in Karl Franz's army does not go amiss. Next up, it gives me no pride at all to award the very first F counterproductive tier unit in all of Warhammer 3. Welcome the Flagellant. God damn, this unit is awful. It is so bad, particularly for tier 3. Running up to the enemy with no armor and basic attacks, this is just such a dated tactic for this stage in the game. If you happen to play with Volkmar the Grim, then these guys get some buffs, but even then, God, they're awful. Our final tier 3 unit is the War Wagon, and boy, this thing used to cop a bollocking. But you know what, it's actually not that bad now. You can kite around enemies and it deals really decent armor piercing damage. Do I go out of my way to hire it? Well, not really, but it can actually be a decent unit. The guns are accurate and can really drill down enemy heroes, so it can be useful against vampires if you're kiting around. If you're a master of micro, you might be able to get more out of this, but the fact it does not really want to get into melee, and there's easier ways to get guns on the field at this point, is the reason why it sits at C tier usable. When you start to fight more dynamic and mobile enemies, you'll probably find it finding shelter within your formations, making you wish that you'd brought handgunners instead. But in tier 4, we have the other Wagon variant, and this is the one with the mortar. Empire, and I just really don't like this unit, but despite that, it is absolutely usable. It's basically a mortar, but you can drag it around a bit easier. So if it's the same as a mortar, but has the added mobility, how does it end up in C tier? Well, I'll tell you why. Recruitment time is a cost in itself. You only have a number of limited slots at this tier 4 gun factory, and instead you would much rather build some of the heavier hitters on this list. The mortar wagon can be useful in sieges, but why bother when you can get Helstorm rocket batteries? This is arguably the most iconic unit in the entire Empire roster, and one of the most signature units, and it used to be spammed like nothing in Warhammer 2 when the AI had no common sense and would just march towards you in a straight line. This thing would blow the enemy apart. People would field armies almost half comprised of these or more, and there wasn't much the AI could do about it. Artillery dodging has neutered the effectiveness of these to some degree, but here's what you do. Stretch your units out to a line and you will definitely be hitting something. If there's something valuable, then just fly ahead with a light mage on a Pegasus and cast Net of Ammontok to hold them in place. Now, you don't spam this unit anymore. 1 or 2 at absolute tops. You might think you want 4, but here's the deal. You will nuke the enemy before they come close. Yes, that's fun, and that might be what you want. Things that threaten the Empire in the late game aren't really in the form of high volume mass, but more in strong single entity creatures. You will need more direct armor piercing damage, which these simply cannot provide. Over-investing in Helstorm rocket batteries is both expensive and also doesn't deal with the biggest threat to you. That said, at this point in tier 4, you probably can rock 4 Helstorm rocket batteries, but once you unlock the units in tier 5, don't get any more than 2. 2 will more than do you. Stretch them out in a wide line and just watch them do some nice damage and soften the enemy up. Still a great unit, love it. Tier 4 really is the prestige tier because now we have the vaunted Demigryph Knights, essentially flightless griffins mounted with a glorious Chad, often with a halberd, and that's one of 2 variants. Now, the halberd variant is very good at dicing up enemy large creatures, which, as previously mentioned, is going to be a concern to you. The regular variant does carry a shield, and in Warhammer 2 you really didn't bother with it, but in Warhammer 3 I think they actually are worth taking now, and they go up to A tier as well. My typical formations will have 2 of the regular and then 2 of the halberd variants. These large muscular beasts only have 32 in their units, but that means if you did bring a life mage, then casting Earthblood will help keep them alive quite handily. If you feel like having some fun, you can throw a warrior priest or a captain on a barded warhorse and then give them some buffs and backup, freeing them up to have another charge. Honestly, if you come across enemy doom stacks in the late game, you might even need these guys to perform line holding duties. The infantry will really start to taper off unless you have that hero support there. In the late game, you'll find yourself needing to build new generals and new armies, and the approach to army building at this stage is completely different. Basically, forget about infantry for these late game doom stacks. Instead, you want to go right down on a steel, which will increase Demigryph Knights' output as well as their damage. Make sure you put at least 1 point Taste for Battle, boost their melee stats by another 5, and gives them 10% physical resistance. Using heroes up the front to catch the enemy to allow your gunpowder to shred, and keeping these guys on the flanks is absolutely essential. With the improved stats of the basic variant and the anti-large given from the halberd variant, you'll find that these guys can deal serious armor piercing and they won't let you down. In the late game, they can hit over 150 armor, they have excellent armor piercing, and that meaty charge bonus means that it will tear apart anything and they will surely break because these beasts have fear. To finish up B tier, we have the cannon, and this has a beastie range and is great at taking down single entities. Whether you use this unit or not will really depend on your army compositions. I'm not a big fan of it, but the reality is it is the hard counter. If you are versing a bunch of bloodthirsters, large single enemies, you will need this to really do some damage before they get close, because those types of enemies, once they get into your ranks, will just tear your handgunners apart. So you need to deal with them from afar. This is the counter. This unit gets very quickly replaced by the next one, the Hellblaster Volleygun. If you did have a bloodthirster flying your way and you point 3 or 4 of these at it, then you will be quickly asking, what bloodthirster? Typical of Empire artillery, this is 3 pieces and each of them is a rotary style minigun machine gun. Armor piercing shells fired at insane velocity, gives excellent range and accuracy. This is just such an important unit for them in the late game. Every single Empire late game army, I would recommend at least 3, but not going too heavy because I also like to have 2 slots for Helstorm rocket batteries. The rocket batteries soften down the enemy formations as they come in, whilst the Hellblaster Volleyguns will focus down the enemy flyers or heroes. It's amazing just how much damage these can do, especially if you follow your the tech tree, as well as the Lord skills. They can just deal an obscene amount of armor piercing damage at excellent range. Now, a unit that's not easy to use is the Luminark. Oh my god, this thing is just... It takes 20 minutes to fire a shot, and if that shot lands, it does insane damage, but it is so unpredictable, so situational, and so matchup dependent. Balthazar Geld gives 20% extra damage on these, so they perform definitely at a B tier, but I wouldn't be surprised if many people demanded that these go in D tier, outperform, because even the terrain of the map can severely limit what these things can do. Just to show that I'm not exaggerating this is Balthazar Geld, and he is the best user of the Luminark, and even he, it's okay, he can get nearly 2000 damage per shot, but it takes 14 seconds to reload the damn thing. Every unit in an Empire army needs to contribute to the overall goal, and you don't really have room for this kind of unpredictability. Now, the final unit in tier 5 and the entire basic roster for the Empire is the Steam Tank, and this provides some sorely needed line holding when you get to the very end of the game. If you do the endgame crisis, you will really feel yourself needing to field something that can hold the line, because this really is the biggest weakness of the Empire come the late stages, is a lack of strong line holding heroes and line holding infantry in general when you deal so much of your damage through artillery. They get excellent cavalry, but without a decent anvil of infantry to hold them in place, this really is quite limited. So the Steam Tank, it's fearless, it has unlimited vigor, and it can of course fire shells, which will do a fair amount of damage. If you have the time and money, having 3 up the front and then some Demigryphs on the flanks will do you very well. They are fearless, so they can be hard to keep alive because they just simply won't run. They can get surrounded because they're large and just damage that way, but you can heal them up with life magic, don't ask how, and honestly, throwing 1 into any army will only help. If you're finding they're not performing for you, then have a look at your formations, because that might be the area that's causing you difficulty. And that's it for tiers 1 to 5 for the Empire. Now we're going to have another video which covers the state troops. We're going to look at the map as to when you get these units and to how useful they are, whether you should rush them and their use, as well as the hero units unique to Marcus Wolfhart, which you can also get by confederating him. Please feel free to drop any comments if you have any suggestions or things that I've missed. Please consider joining the channel or supporting on Patreon, or even just join on Discord for free and have your say. But if you know anyone getting into the game, please share this channel, and I'm doing my absolute best to give the newcomers the guides that they deserve. This is Oven Plot Armor. See you next time.